All told, this was a pretty good year for movies, mostly because the stuff that was good was really f***ing good, but we've already talked about that last week. In any case, it's helpful to remind ourselves how good the year was overall when faced with today's conundrum. I set out to make a 10 worst list for the year, and realized I'd seen so many flat-out bad movies, bewildering flops, middling trash, and well-intentioned but high-profile disappointments that I just couldn't get it down to 10. So, for the first time ever, seriously, I hope this isn't a trend, I present to you my terrible 20. Part 1. Number 20, Interstellar. Between this movie, American Sniper, and Exodus, you might call 2014 the year of movies Steven Spielberg almost directed, and probably still should have. This was supposed to be the film that finally proved Christopher Nolan to be the one true heir to that other grandly visionary British auteur with the technical genius out the wazoo, but the emotional understanding of a TI-84. Here, he struggles mightily to fit a human core into his signature passionless, hyper-realistic plot machinations, and comes up heartbreakingly short. Is Interstellar a bad movie? Grudgingly, I think it gets there, yeah, though mainly because it aims high but falls hard. Number 19, Godzilla. Yes, this one comes with a caveat. Once Godzilla shows up and director Gareth Edwards decides to actually photograph him, Godzilla turns pretty great, even if the big fight scene is against two kaiju so monumentally boring I'm not sure they even deserve the name. But before that, this was a big letdown that tries to mimic the hide-the-shark brilliance of Jaws, but fails to give us anything interesting to watch in the meantime. We spend most of the movie following around boring, cardboard heroes, and not only does the movie sideline Godzilla, it also sidelines the one interesting character who's from the franchise's native country and whose whole characterization is guy who already knows everything about Godzilla. Yes, the ending kicks ass. No, it doesn't make up for the rest of the movie, and no, I'm not looking forward to drab, joyless versions of Mothra, Rodan, and King Ghidorah in the sequel. Number 18, Exodus. Can someone please help Ridley Scott? The once visionary filmmaker remains a grand visual stylist and a technical powerhouse, but he's lost sight of the narrative, theme, and other elements that gave his greatest films their lasting weight. Here, he turns in a junky, boring, action-epic version of the Moses story mainly as an excuse for handfuls of big set pieces that actually look kind of ordinary and end up meaning nothing. And that's before we get to the film's troublingly whitewashed casting choices. Number 17, Sin City, A Dame to Kill For. You'll find no greater apologist for Robert Rodriguez than me. I still dig the hell out of his stuff when he's on point, but in trying to make the Sin City lightning strike twice, his enthusiasm and energy crashed up against the inescapable fact of there simply not being any there when it comes to the work of disgraced former comics legend Frank Miller. Basically, nothing Miller is known for has ever actually held up all that well upon revisitation, and it turns out the Sin City franchise is no different. This could probably stand to be higher up on the badness scale, actually, but I felt compelled to be merciful because despite everything else, hot damn was Ava Green amazing in this. Can we get her into some good movies, please? Number 16, The Legend of Hercules. I don't remember a single thing that happened in this other than the awesome B-movie action star Scott Adkins showing up and then not getting to do anything. Nobody saw this, nobody cares, and I'm given to wonder if The Rock didn't fund this thing secretly just to make sure he wasn't in the worst Hercules movie this year. Number 15, Annabelle. Hey, remember how good and simple yet scary as hell The Conjuring was? Yeah. Well, remember how there's a completely out-of-place subplot about a stupid haunted doll in the middle of it so they have something iconic for the poster? Yeah, they gave the doll its own movie. It's terrible. Number 14, Dumb and Dumber 2. I remember when you were great, Jim Carrey, and I still believe you can be great again. But I'll admit it, I believe it a little less after this. Number 13, Tammy. I think Melissa McCarthy is one of the most interesting, vital, and talented comic performers working today, but Tammy is so forcefully, willfully awful, it feels like a deliberate act of radical self-purgation, as though McCarthy is lashing out at her most strident critics. I'll show them what she just makes gross fat girl fall-down movies looks like. If so, I can't fault her for the anger, but I hope she gets back to doing good movies and pushing her career forward all the same, because this is not where she deserves to be. Number 12, Tusk. Hey, Kevin Smith? Director of Clerks, Mallrats, Chasing Amy, Dogma, etc., one-time leading light of both American independent cinema and the film geek revolution. Yeah, it's me, Bob. Big fan once upon a time. Did you hear all that hopeful yet melancholy stuff I said to Jim Carrey a minute ago? Yeah, I kind of feel the opposite right now. I'm sorry. I still like that Clerks cartoon. Number 11, Heaven is for Real. Ugh. For some reason, there were a lot of bad religious movies this year. I don't know why. Heaven is for Real wasn't the worst one, not by a country mile, but it was still pretty bad. Effectively an infomercial for a highly profitable mass media ministry built around the supposed near-death experiences of a small child. It's as treacly and pointless as you'd expect, and seeing actual Hollywood actors showing up to stumble through this nonsense made for one of the year's most bizarre spectacles. That it's also an infomercial for Spider-Man, Vio, laptops, and other Sony products was the cherry on the sundae. Well, that was certainly painful. Next week, don your armor and dig in your heels for the bottom 10 worst movies of the year. It's gonna get ugly. Last week, I gave you the worst and/or most disappointing movies of 2014, numbers 20 through 11. And if you thought those were stinkers, you ain't seen nothing yet. Or maybe you did. Some of these were actually pretty successful. I don't know. Anyway. Number 10, Divergent. Here's a franchise so lazy and cookie-cutter, even among the far-from-original young adult dystopia genre, that I actually considered watching it again to make sure I wasn't accidentally thinking of scenes from The Maze Runner. Another hopelessly generic, failed future society as high school cafeteria hierarchy metaphor. It starred Shailene Woodley as the one special and unique teenage heroine. Unsure of her place in who may be the only hope to destroy an allegorical caste system which holds them in bondage. Sorry. You get the idea. Number 9, Transcendence. Here's a science fiction film that doesn't seem to care much for science or filmmaking, or its audience. Johnny Depp becomes the ghost in the machine and commits unspeakable acts on helpless victims. No, not the townspeople from the movie, the people in the theater. Number 8, American Sniper. Clint Eastwood fails, or maybe just chooses not to, find the dramatic through line in the life of an American military hero. Unfocused and weirdly cheap-looking, American Sniper meanders from one episodic set piece to another without ever finding the core of the man it's supposed to depict. It's dull, dreary, and leaves its audience with no real insight into a decade of war or the man it places at its center. In a late-year glut surprisingly dense with underwhelming Oscar bait, this was the one I wanted to like the most and was disappointed in to the same degree. Number 7, RoboCop. There's no possible way that a neutered PG-13 cash-in remake of RoboCop, one of the greatest sci-fi action films of all time, was going to be a good idea. But this remake is so stiflingly bad, lifeless, directionless, overly slick, and representative of everything wrong with modern action movies and then some, it was kind of a marvel to behold. It's so thoroughly wrong-headed in such thuddingly obvious ways, I almost want to imagine that it's a deliberate satire of itself. Then I remember that it's a blasphemous remake of a movie that wrote the book on doing action movie satire right, and I just get sad again. This wasn't just a bad remake, this was pop culture vandalism. Number 6, I Origins. Look, I get that being into obsolete stuff my grandparents were nostalgic for is a thing among indie scene brats these days, but I never imagined creationism would be one of them. In I Origins, one of the most embarrassing manic pixie dream girl stock characters ever conjured breezes into the life of a scientist to teach him the error of his evolution-proving eyeball research by way of a moronic mystical plot twist that points us to one of the dumbest codas in pseudo-sci-fi history. Good news, kids! Science was wrong. There is an intelligent designer after all, but don't worry, it's not that boring judgmental one your parents and everybody back home was into. Nah, it's one of the cool Eastern ones that white hipsters can appropriate to mean whatever they want it to. Number 5, America. Imagine a world without her. This hilariously self-serious propaganda piece masquerading as a documentary swirls the filmmaker's various political and ideological opponents into a cartoon conspiracy theory alleging a decades-old sinister plot by a shadowy cabal scheming to, make Americans feel badly about certain moments in their history, seems to be the scandal. Look, crap like this is a dime a dozen in an election year, but this one really stood out from the pack with its eye-popping xenophobia and the hatchet job it performs on the American history it claims to educate about. It's the kind of bad movie where you look at it and say, the guy who made this should be arrested. And, funny enough, he was arrested. I mean, not for making this movie, he committed campaign finance fraud, but hey, still. Number 4, Winter's Tale. I'm not even going to try and explain what happened here. I just can't. I just can't. You cannot be told what Winter's Tale is. You have to experience it for yourself. Just don't say I didn't warn you. Number 3, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Somehow, even though the actual source material is what it is, even though there's a better version of this on TV right now minimizing the impact of this thing, even though we already pretty much knew this was going to be awful, accepted it, processed it, and dealt with it months ago, somehow this movie still managed to surprise with just how bad it really was. What stuck out the most was how little actually stuck out. The film is so by the numbers, it feels like they shot the entire movie and then decided which characters they were going to mad in over the motion capture actors, as though with a few keystrokes this easily could have been the Street Sharks, or Wildcats, or Micronauts, and nothing else would need to change. Mostly, I feel bad for the current generation of young fans, who deserved a better movie. I mean, I got one, why shouldn't they? Number 2, God's Not Dead. I want to be clear here, this movie is not on the list because I'm somehow ideologically opposed to it, but hey, thanks for assuming that anyway. No, this movie is on the list because it's terrible, that rare combination where a hateful, rancid premise is exactly matched by the ugliness, cynicism, and ineptitude of its physical form. In telling the story of a bratty, self-righteous college student who debates a skeptical professor on the subject of faith, God's Not Dead can barely even be bothered to actually argue for itself, preferring to meander into side stories about how atheism will give you cancer, adherents to rival religions are child abusers, business success is a tool of Satan, and sage advice being doled out by a Christian rock band working a cameo as themselves. God never shows up to argue on his own behalf, by the way. This turns out to be the sort of movie that regards a guest spot by one of the fake rednecks from Duck Dynasty as a reasonable vessel for the good word. Not to belabor a gag, but this movie was holy sh**. Number 1, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Remember when that was as bad as a Spider-Man movie could get? Yeah. Those were the days. You know, on balance, there are probably movies on this list that hurt to watch more than The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but none of them so perfectly, horrifyingly encapsulate everything wrong and rotten about this moment in Hollywood filmmaking. A thuddingly unnecessary superhero reboot of an even less necessary superhero reboot, joylessly cranked out from the creative dead zone of the Sony Corporation, that exists not to bring a classic story to life, not to tell an exciting new story, not even just for fun, but for passionless corporate brand management. Oh, and of course it's an Orsi and Kurtzman joint to complete the awful, awful picture. My favorite superhero is the face of 2 of the worst superhero movies ever made. My New Year's resolution? Try not to let that bother me so much. I'm Bob, and welcome to 2015.